For the third reading this morning, I've chosen a piece from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and it's fairly densely packed, but it's deeply, deeply mystical. And I just want to explain two words. When Paul speaks about the world or this age, he's not talking about Pachamama or about Gaia. He's talking about a secular mindset, a kind of a materialistic mindset. And so in this small little passage, the word spirit is repeated 12 times, and the word God is repeated 12 times. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 6 to 16. We speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. No, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, as it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him, these are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit. The Spirit teaches and searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, explaining spiritual realities with Spirit-taught words. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. The person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgments. For who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. Words inspired by God. It's interesting when you look at biblical theology, particularly the mystical biblical theology, that the words that we use in English as dreams and visions are actually synonyms in Hebrew. And so there's a great passage from the prophet Joel, who flourished about 400 years BCE, in which he says, in the days to come, I will pour out my Spirit about all humankind. Your young men will see visions and your old men will dream dreams. And I used to think this was kind of a form of discrimination, that the young men had visions and the old men only had dreams. But in fact, in Hebrew, they're identical, they're synonyms. So basically, a vision is a waking dream, and a dream is a sleeping vision. And actually, St. Peter picks up on that on his famous Pentecost sermon. He quotes the prophet Joel. And so dreams and visions are identical. And I know personally that most of my homilies and lectures and writings come from those two sources, from visions during meditation and from dreams at night. I record my dreams. And in fact, today's homily actually comes from a dream I had just 2 nights ago on February 10th. And using that, I'm going to make a deeper dive into the question of ascension that I've been dealing with for the last few weeks. So I make 4 main points this morning. And the first one is, I want to look at, what does the brain mean? What's with the brain? And then I'm going to look at different versions of brain. So behavioral psychology, which was the second movement in psychology after psychoanalysis under Freud. Then you had behavioral psychology, which did a kind of a volte-face, a 180, claiming in fact that consciousness does not exist. So we're born tabula rasa. We're like empty boards that you can write anything on. And so using Skinner boxes, you can just data in, behavior out. And the attempt to kind of train children in that model, that you regard them as just empty vessels that you could put information into so as to elicit some kind of behavior, that was behavioral psychology. Consciousness does not exist for behavioral psychology. Gratefully, humanistic psychology and then transpersonal psychology, went much further than that. And that was allied to a kind of a scientism, a belief that the brain creates consciousness as a kind of an epiphenomenon of neuronal firing. So it's basically a biochemical process in the brain that creates, the illusion of consciousness, but it's not. It's just the brain working and firing. Now, gratefully, there's a branch of modern science called biocentrism, which is beginning to realize again how crazy that idea is. So biocentrism is a much more enlightened, modern version of science, which realizes that the brain is not the origin of consciousness. It's merely a transmitter and a receiver. It's not a source. And so matter does not create consciousness. Consciousness creates matter. And to use a kind of a simple example, those of you who will watch the Super Bowl today on TV, if your television set breaks down in the middle, of the Super Bowl, it doesn't mean that the game has stopped. So the TV is simply a mechanism to transduce audiovisual signals, electromagnetic signals into an audio and a visual way. That's all the brain does. It's a kind of a transducer, a receiver and receiver, a receiver and transmitter of consciousness. So the brain, the physical brain, and particularly in the area at the back of the head called the reticular activating system, is ultimately just a kind of a reducer in order to create the ego and avoid overload. Otherwise, we'd be totally suffused by the myriad of experiences the senses are delivering to us on a non-stop basis. So we have got this reducing valve at the base of the skull, that allows us to create a sense of individual self, we call the ego, and to avoid the overload. And that's what happens sometimes, for instance, when you come across somebody like an autistic savant, somebody, for whom the reducer has been opened and the gates to genius, the information is flooding through. The downside, unfortunately, is that they tend to have very poor ego or very poor social skills because they're overpowered by all of the incoming data. So the brain is not the creator by any chance, it's simply a reducer. When you move then into kind of a mystical cosmology, away from behavioral psychology and from scientism, and you come to mystical cosmology, then we understand, I believe, I would hold that the notion of the collective unconscious and the notion of what I would call a super consciousness is not created or even mediated by the physical brain, but by higher levels of the chakra system. So that's where it's coming from. And so deep mystical states are, I would describe as transcranial and transmental connections to source. Of course, they will leave traces on the psyche, just as like ocean waves leave their signature on the beach. But the mystical states are beyond mind and beyond physicality. So having said that, then I would look at the notion of, are you waking up or waking down? When your alarm clock goes off in the morning, are you actually waking up? Or are you waking down? So the four fundamental elements of science are space, time, energy, and matter. And during daylight hours, that becomes our reality. Our reality consists of space and time and energy and matter. And then we go to sleep at night and we dream. And now these four elements, these four forces change radically. So when you're dreaming, for instance, time is gone and space is gone and even matter is gone. When you learn how to dream lucidly, in fact, there's a test. If you become aware in the middle of a dream that you're actually dreaming and you become lucid, to test your lucidity and to test the fact that you're actually dreaming, the trick is to put your hand against some solid surface and to push through it, and indeed it'll go through it. So in the dream space, there is no time, there is no space, and matter is very different. And there are different kinds of causation. It's instantaneous. As soon as you think of something, you manifest it. And then the alarm clock goes off and you're catapulted back into time, into space, into matter, into energy, and into causation. So I'm saying then that we're not actually waking up when the alarm clock goes off, we're waking down. We're waking down into more and more dense levels of experience and denser levels of reality. And now, to make matters worse, the whole transhumanist agenda is an effort to reduce even further, to reduce our consciousness until we become simply hackable, programmable robots. And then this waking dream is headed for a full-on nightmare, almost a night terror. If you've ever had the experience of a night terror, it's where your mind wakes up, but your body and senses are still paralyzed. So you're stuck in this spacesuit and you can't move any part of it, but your mind is alive, and it's called a night terror. And in some senses, that's the ultimate goal of transhumanism, that we become malleable minds that have zero ability to direct our own lives. And the remedy, it is to refuse to be corralled into this sheep pen. So I want to look then at the Hindu notion of the 7 bodies, and I'm going to try to map science onto that. So as I said, the 4 foundational elements of science are space, time, energy, and matter. And in fact, Einstein's famous formula, E equals mc squared, it ties all these 4 together. Now, what I want to do now is I want to try to map that onto a Hindu cosmology in which the chakras involve dimensional shifts from one level to the other. So let's start with the most kind of the obvious, the physical body. At the physical body, all these 4 elements hold good. We're in space, we're in time, there's energy and there's matter. So with the physical body, science is true. However, when we shift into the etheric body, we now have to redefine what energy actually means, maybe using concepts like quantum entanglement and quantum tunneling. So in order to realize that we're not separated in time or separated in space from others. So the most difficult of the 4 to comprehend is energy itself. So Einstein's formula was E equals mc squared, where E stands for energy, m stands for mass, and c is the speed of light. Now, speed is predicated on 2 dimensions. You estimate speed by calculating the distance traveled and the time it took to travel. So it's distance divided by time, or space divided by time. So you can't understand light, the speed of light, until you have space and time. Without space or time, energy then must be completely different. And in science, mass is the measurement of the amount of matter in a body. And the unit of mass is the kilogram. And so if matter also doesn't exist, then Einstein's formula is useless for higher levels. So for instance, if you take a golf ball, there was a famous American astronaut who hit some golf balls on the moon. Now, when he took the golf ball from Earth to the moon, the mass of the golf ball was exactly the same, but the weight was completely different, because weight is mass multiplied by a gravitational force. And so it had far less weight, although it had the same mass. And so if matter doesn't exist and time doesn't exist and space doesn't exist, then Einstein's formula is not going to take us into mystical realms. And so at the higher levels of the Hindu cosmology, we don't need space, we don't need time, or we don't need mass. And we call for a radically different understanding of what energy might mean. But the interesting thing is, as you work your way up through these models of the Hindu body, as you go from the physical to the etheric to the astral, etc., in spite of the fact that we're losing space, we're losing time, we're changing energy, and we're losing mass, what happens is, instead of a diminution of consciousness, we experience increased consciousness. So once we let go of space and time and energy and matter, we're actually increasing consciousness. So when we get to the astral level, that's the place, for instance, where our emotions reside, where our dreams come from, and it's the archive of the last incarnation once we die physically. At the astral level then, there is no need for space, there is no need for time, or no need for mass. And as I say, it is a different form of energy. When we get to the next level, the mental body, and don't confuse mental body with physical brain, they're very different. We're talking about Plato's ideal realm, the place from which you download all great insights. Now, at that stage now, you're letting go even further of space, time, energy, and matter. When you get to the psychic body in the Hindu model, this is the place, where you archive all of the information and all of the experiences of all your incarnations. And it's a place where you are clairaudient, clairsentient, clairvoyant, and telepathic. Now, clairaudience, the ability to kind of hear at a distance. You're hearing a message, although you're a long, long way from the person who's making the sound. And clairsentience is the ability to feel another person's essence at a distance. And clairvoyance is the ability to see at a distance, like remote viewing. And telepathy is the ability to kind of download somebody else's thoughts. So obviously, clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyance, telepathy, they don't need space. They're out of space. And then precognition obviously means you don't need time. Precognition is the ability to foretell the future. And psychokinesis, the ability to move matter mentally, just by mind, obviously shows that you have psychic control over even matter. And so when you get to the soul body, the penultimate level, the soul body has neither space, nor time, nor energy, nor matter. In fact, all science is gone at that stage. And at this stage now, you're moving back into source, which is unitive consciousness and unconditional love. That's all that remains. Now that's kind of dense stuff. So I was trying to come up with a metaphor that could make that more kind of understandable. And here's what I came up with. I want to look at water as a metaphor for consciousness. So where I live on my mountaintop up here in Healdsburg, yeah, there's a little spring, just about a half a mile from my house that feeds down a very, very narrow ravine. And it feeds down into a little creek called Chapman. And Chapman flows down about a mile and a half, and it joins another creek called Pena Creek. And Pena Creek goes for 5 or 6 miles, and it feeds into Dry Creek. And Dry Creek feeds several miles. It goes into the Russian River near Healdsburg. And then the Russian River comes out into the Pacific Ocean around Jenner. And the Pacific Ocean, obviously, is just part of a huge ocean that we've artificially divided into Atlantic and Pacific, etc. So if I were starting from home and I took that journey, there'd be more and more water as I made the journey downwards. Now, what would happen if I made the journey in reverse? Suppose, for instance, an extraterrestrial were to land, off the coast of Ceylon. It would find itself in the Indian Ocean. Now, suppose it had found a big boat and it started sailing southwest. It would eventually encounter the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, which is where the Indian Ocean meets the Atlantic Ocean. And if it continued in a southwesterly direction, it would eventually meet Cape Horn in Argentina, where the Atlantic meets the Pacific. And then if it started going north-northwest and hugged the coastline of South America and Mesoamerica and North America, eventually it would find itself off the coast of California. And at some stage, when it reached a little town called Jenner, it would see the Russian River. And if you took a right into the Russian River and went up the Russian River for many, many miles, you follow it, eventually you'd meet Dry Creek near the town of Healdsburg. And if you took a left onto Dry Creek and kept going upstream, you would find Pena Creek. And eventually, after a few miles, to your left again, you would find a little creek called Chapman Branch. And if you went up far enough and took a right, you'd find a little spring that bubbles up near my home. So that's what waking down looks like. You start in the ocean and you wind up in a tiny little spring where you get hand over foot. Now, at each stage of this journey, you're going to need a different kind of transport. Maybe the ET starts off with a huge big ocean liner off the coast of Ceylon. And it uses that, to circumnavigate most of the world, right from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, right up the coast of South America, Mesoamerica, North America. But once it got to the Russian River, it obviously couldn't use that kind of a boat anymore. He'd have to substitute it with maybe a motorboat and come up the Russian River in a motorboat, up until reached, close to Healdsburg. But then the water is too shallow. He'd have to abandon the motorboat and start using a canoe and start paddling his way up, the rest of the Russian River. And then when he got onto Dry Creek, he'd have to substitute even the canoe for a little rubber dinghy because it has less draft. And then he'd come up, Dry Creek onto Pena Creek. And at that stage, he'd have to abandon even the dinghy. And now he'd be paddling in maybe through waist-high water. And then he'd go on up to Chapman. And then to try to get up to my spring, he's on his hands and knees, crawling from rock to rock to get up to the top. Now, at each stage in this process, there's less and less water. In other words, there's less and less consciousness. So we've now gone from the source to the space suit. Now, enlightenment is learning to reverse that process, to start at my little spring and go all the way down until I meet the one great ocean of the planet. So I said on a famous occasion that, life is simply a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that source is having. So it's a question of abandoning kind of smaller and smaller craft until finally we have an ocean liner that takes us right into the great waters of the planet. So it's a question of disidentification and re-identification. That's really what waking up means. We're not awake when the alarm clock goes off. We're going into a deeper and deeper form of sleep. And so we need to reverse that journey. And for me, it's a question of disidentifying with the spacesuit, realizing that the spacesuit is simply a vessel I need for incarnation. And it's not a very great vessel. It's not really going to get me to the ocean. I have to trade it in, for a motorboat or for a liner at some stage. So I have to disidentify with my physicality, and then disidentify with my emotionality, and then disidentify with my intellectuality, and even disidentify with my personality, and realize that I am a soul. I am a bite-sized piece of God. I have to identify with my soul self so that finally I can identify with my source self, which is God. And this was Jesus' grace teaching on compassion. The word in Hebrew and Aramaic, the word rachamim, which literally means to be womb-like. It means to keep birthing greater and greater versions of yourself until finally you deliver God. And that is the process of ascension. It is having the courage to start off at the tiny little spring near your home and follow the course of it all the way to the ocean. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.